This chapter is chapter 4, which is going to cover for us the carbohydrates. Following this chapter, we'll be spending a whole chapter talking just about fats and the other lipids, and then we'll be spending a whole chapter talking about protein. So each of the macronutrients are going to be broken down into their own chapters. So this chapter we're going to highlight in this lecture, talk a little bit about some of the primary aspects, the different types of carbohydrates, but of course to get the full information from this chapter, you want to make sure that you do go back and you look at the reading and spend a little bit of time with the textbook also. One of the major things that we can find within this chapter is really getting down and defining what is a whole grain versus what is a refined grain. So we can look at these two different things, which are terms that you're probably very familiar with and have probably heard a lot, trying to increase your whole grain intake, or, getting advice to try to avoid eating too many refined grains. But we can look at what this actually means. In the picture on the left, that is wheat that's growing in a field. And if we take a look at the wheat, the head of the wheat there, it's broken down into different wheat kernels. Now, biologically, what that actually means is that those are the seeds. So if we replant those, we can grow a new wheat plant. And all seeds, have special things to them. Seeds are going to have things like an outer covering to help protect the seed on the inside. It's going to have a little plant embryo or a baby plant, fertilized egg, a baby plant. And that plant embryo is basically, under the right conditions, it's going to be able to grow up and be a new, in this case, a wheat plant. And then there's what's known as the endosperm. The endosperm is basically the food for the plant embryo, and that's going to provide the baby plant with basically the food that it's going to need until it starts its own photosynthesis. So we break those down. The endosperm is the food, and we're going to see a lot of the carbohydrates that are going to be found there. A lot of the starches are there, but you also have some proteins, vitamins, and minerals that are found there too. The outermost layer, that's that seed coat to help protect the seed. That's known as the bran. Really, really good source of fiber. And then again, we'll also see vitamins and minerals there. And the germ is also known, it's just another name for the plant embryo. And this is a really, really good source of oils. We're going to see fats in here, and also vitamin E. Now, when we refine grains, typically what's done is you remove that seed coat, so you get rid of the bran, and you also strip the germ out of the plant. So you're left with just the endosperm. So the really starchy, very carbohydrate-rich part of that seed. This chart shows the difference between whole wheat flour, and that's, again, where you're going to make flour out of that entire kernel. So you've got, your germ in there, you've got the bran in there, and the endosperm. So we're doing a little comparison here. So whole wheat flour, we're going to say that that is 100%. It doesn't mean 100% of your daily intake. It's just using that as a reference point, saying, all right, if we want to compare whole wheat flour to refined, enriched flour, this is what we're looking at. So in the yellow there, you'll see the nutrients in the refined flour. After you've removed the bran and after you've removed the germ from the plant, you can see, compared to the 100%, that there's a lot less fiber there, less than 50% of what you started with. Much, much less vitamin E, less thiamine, less riboflavin, less niacin. So all those little yellow bars on the left, that represents how much nutrients are left after you've refined that grain. Now, by law, we are, a lot of companies have to add certain nutrients back in that were lost during the refinement process. That's something that's known as enrichment. So when you've removed it and now you're going to mix it back in to try to, increase the nutrient intake, you're going to enrich it. And those are those red bars there. And you can see the different nutrients that are added back in. Primarily, you're looking at a lot of your B vitamins, your thiamine, your riboflavin, your niacin. We've got our folate and our iron being added back in. But we're still not adding back in the fiber or the vitamin E or the B6 or the copper. So that whole wheat flour has all of those things in it. They're removed during refinement, they're not added back in. So there's a little bit of give and take here. So when we talk about whole grain and whole wheat flour being healthier, it's being healthier because you've got all those additional nutrients. Now, while enriching it is good because you're adding things back in, it doesn't add everything back in. So there are definitely some drawbacks there. Let's take a look at some definitions here to continue on with this material. Refined sugars, your white sugars that are in pop and in candy. They contain calories, so they are a source of energy, so that can be beneficial, but they don't have fiber and other nutrients added in them. So typically when we want to, consume different sugars, we want to get them primarily from our whole foods, our fruit, our vegetables, because those are going to be more nutrient dense for us. So for every calorie that you're consuming, you're not just getting just the energy, you're also going to be getting the vitamins and minerals and fiber, so you get more bang for your buck. In other words, you're going to be getting more nutrients within that calorie rich food. And sometimes not so calorie rich food. Here's an example of what we're talking about with those empty calories. Empty calories are going to be the things that have lots of sugar in them or lots of calories in them, but you're not getting that added benefit from the other nutrients. So here's two, foods. So if we want to look at kiwi versus soda, and we want to look at the equivalent calorie amount. So for your kiwi that you're consuming, you're going to assume that have just about the same amount of calories in the soda you're consuming. And if we go down the line, we can see that the kiwi is going to give us carbohydrates, and so is the pop, and that's, going to give us energy. But the kiwi has the added benefit, is more nutrient dense because it also contains vitamin C and folate and a lot more calcium. Whereas the pop has your calories, your carbs, a tiny bit of calcium in there, but otherwise it's really empty calories. You're consuming that energy source, but you're not getting any extra benefits from that calorie source like what you would if you consumed the fruit. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, we have this whole family of different molecules that fall under the umbrella of carbohydrates. So in the top there, you can see carbs in general, and in general, you're going to see carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens make up our carbohydrates. So for example, we can look at the general equation for glucose is going to be C6H12O6. So for every carbon and oxygen, there's two hydrogens. That's just the proportion of how we see things. Now, our carbs, we can break them down into complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates. In general, when we relate that to everyday life, typically when you think about complex carbohydrates, that's going to be things like your rice and your pastas, where the simples, we tend to associate those with sweeter things. With our refined sugars we find in cakes and candies and pop, but also it includes our different sugars we find in things like fruits. So if we break down on the left side there, the complex carbohydrates, that's your polysaccharides, meaning many, and saccharides is referring to sugar units. So it's going to be a lot of different small little sugars like glucose molecules that are connected together. Under the polysaccharides, we see three different categories: the glycogen, the starch, and the fiber. So we'll spend a little bit of time with those. And then fiber is further broken down into two varieties, our soluble and insoluble fiber. On the right-hand side, we see simple carbohydrates, and that's going to be our monosaccharides or disaccharides. Again, we're going to break these down into individual sugar units. Mono is 1, di is 2. So our monosaccharides are galactose, glucose, and fructose. And our disaccharides are lactose, maltose, and sucrose. So if we look here, we see our three major monosaccharides, our glucose, and that's known as blood sugar. This is how we transport sugar in our blood. And I don't expect you to memorize the exact chemical equation or how this is put together. But you can recognize that what you're seeing there in pink, those are single sugar units. They have a ring formation to them. So we have got our carbons and our oxygen that kind of turns in on itself into a ring formation. Carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen, C6H12O6. And they are arranged slightly different, the glucose, the galactose, and the fructose, from one to another. But really big thing here, monosaccharides are a single sugar unit. Disaccharides, on the other hand, are going to be double units. So di is 2. So we can see our three major families here. We can see the maltose, which are 2 glucose molecules put together. And typically when we see maltose, it's really a byproduct of breaking down larger sugars. So we can get into our starches. So if you have something like bread or pasta, you have a lot of starch within that. When we break it down within the body, our body will break that down into maltose, which are 2 glucose molecules connected or bonded with one another. And then it'll undergo further reaction to separate those glucose molecules from one another. Another example is sucrose, and that's our table sugar. So this is what we find in honey. This is what we find in table sugar and maple syrup. So very, very sweet. 1 glucose plus 1 fructose. And then we can also have lactose, which should remind you of dairy products because that's where we find our lactose. It's also a disaccharide composed of galactose and glucose. So 2 monosaccharides that are bonded together give us a disaccharide. Now, if we start connecting all of these things together, particularly lots and lots of glucose molecules, we get our complex carbohydrates. So we'll talk about our glycogen, starch, and fiber here. So complex carbohydrates are long, long strings of glucose molecules connected end to end to end. And sometimes you have a lot of branching, sometimes you have a little bit of branching between these molecules. Now, when we take in excess sugar, our body does a few different things with it. A lot of excess, it can turn it into fat. But we also store excess sugar as glycogen within the liver and within our muscles. And that glycogen is simply taking simple carbohydrates, the monosaccharides, and connecting them together. Glycogen, as you can see, is highly branched. We're not the only ones that store excess sugar as glycogen. Animals do, in general. All animals do. And kind of something strange and interesting too is that fungi, so different mushrooms, will also store their excess sugars as glycogen. Starch, on the other hand, is how plants store their excess sugar. So as they're producing through photosynthesis, they're producing these sugar molecules, these glucose molecules, they start connecting them end to end, and you end up with starch. So plants store excess sugars as starch. We store excess sugars as glycogen. Starch can be branched. It's typically just less branched than what you find out of the glycogen. And then lastly there, you can see fiber. Now, the big thing with the fiber illustration is you can see those really thick lines in between those glucose molecules. That represents a type of bonding that we do not have a particular enzyme that will break that bond within the body. So where we can break down starch, we cannot break down fiber ourselves, but fiber does play some really important nutritional roles for us. Oh, and even though, one more thing, even though you do find glycogen stored within muscle, it breaks down shortly after death. So even though if you eat meat, meat's a great source of protein and fat, vitamins, minerals, water, you typically are not getting any carbohydrates within that meat because the glycogen is already broken down within that meat. So we're not typically consuming glycogen, but we end up consuming lots of starch through our diet. So when we consume glucose and any other sugar, any other form of sugar, our body's job is basically to digest it. We're going to break that down so it's the smallest unit possible, or glucose molecules, and then absorb that into our system. Now, when we have too much of anything, we can turn it into fat. So our excess sugar will start off by storing it as glycogen in our liver and our muscles, and then any additional glucose past that will store as fat, and we really don't have a limit on that, on how much fat we can store. Ultimately, where these sugars have come from photosynthesis. So we'll spend a little bit of time here talking about photosynthesis in general, and how that feeds into our food supply. So the general equation for photosynthesis, and this is what plants undergo, is the sunlight's going to basically be the energy provider for this process. Plants take in carbon dioxide and water, so water through their roots. Carbon dioxide is going to come into the plant from the atmosphere, so from the air that surrounds us. The solar energy is going to provide the source of energy for chemical reactions that will take that carbon dioxide and that water and end up giving us glucose, or C6H12O6, plus oxygen as a byproduct. So when we talk about plants being a good source of oxygen for the atmosphere, that's what we're talking about here. The photosynthesis helps them to, allows them to be able to release the oxygen back into the environment again. And if you are into chemistry and this drives you crazy, what you're seeing here, that it doesn't balance on the left and right, you can just, you can make note that it's 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters fueled by the sun will give you the glucose and your 6 oxygens. The plants, once they have those glucose molecules, they can convert them into different things, such as starch and fiber. So here's another illustration just showing you the energy from the sun feeds this process. The plant has carbon dioxide and water, releases oxygen as a byproduct, and the ultimate goal with photosynthesis is to provide glucose that the plant can store as starch. Now, it's convenient to think about how plants, maybe they do this for us because we consume the glucose and we consume the starch within the plant. But plants need energy too. Plants need energy to grow and to reproduce, being able to produce flowers and seeds and make new leaves. So plants need energy, and just how glucose and starch is a form of energy for us, it's also a form of energy for the plant. It's a food source. So photosynthesis provides the plant, it makes its own food, and we just happen to benefit from that because when we consume plants, we then also can get the glucose and the starch from those plants. Again, here you can find your complex carbohydrates, which are long chains of glucose. So you connect those glucoses together. You can get glycogen, which is highly branched. You get different starches, and they tend to be less branched, and that's how plants store their excess sugars. But it's also how we consume our sugars, or one of the ways we consume our sugars is through starch, these large polysaccharides. And then on the right there we have fiber, or also known as cellulose. And this really helps a lot of plants to be able to give them a little bit of strength and structure. So even though we can't break it down, it does have its benefits for the plants. And it does have health benefits for us, even though we can't directly use it for energy, since we can't break down those glucose molecules. Now in that umbrella, in that different chart that we saw towards the beginning, we could see that we break down all of our fiber into 2 categories, soluble and insoluble. Now we can get to the base, the root of the word soluble and insoluble, and really what that means is whether or not it dissolves in water. Functionally for us, though, it's going to give us a different benefits. The soluble fiber breaks down or dissolves in water, so it mixes very well within our system. We partially digest it within our large intestine, but it's not actually us doing the digesting, it's the bacteria that lives within our large intestine. So when those bacteria start breaking down the soluble fiber, it releases a little bit of energy. We can actually use that energy. And soluble fiber is also what can lead to gas, because the bacteria, as they're breaking down that fiber, they also are going to be releasing gases that can build up in your large intestine. Soluble fiber can do things like helping to lower cholesterol. It does that because it can bind with what is known as bile. And we'll talk about bile when we get into the fat chapters. But when we talk about lowering cholesterol, bile is made out of cholesterol. We take cholesterol and we produce this substance, this chemical called bile. Most of the time the body will reabsorb the bile and recycle it, reuse it. So it doesn't need any more cholesterol to make new bile. However, when we consume soluble fiber, it actually grabs onto that bile and we end up excreting the bile, which means our body now has to withdraw more cholesterol from the blood and use that cholesterol to produce more bile. So in this case, the lack of recycling is actually a beneficial thing for us. The insoluble fiber, again, doesn't dissolve in water, and that's really just the definition of being insoluble. It also doesn't get broken down by the bacteria. So the benefits really here with insoluble fiber is, one of its major benefits is adding to fecal bulk. So it helps with the movement of waste material throughout our system, and it adds to that fecal bulk, which can be beneficial for us. So it tends to reduce constipation. Carbohydrate digestion is really important, of course, with all digestion, which we talked about in chapter 3. The big goal here is to take a large molecule, break it down into a smaller molecule so that it's small enough that we can absorb it into our system. So it gets out of the lumen, or the interior portion of that digestive system, and comes in, gets into our bloodstream, into our lymphatic system, and then we can utilize those different nutrients. You can see the full breakdown here on the left. Carbohydrates start the breakdown process within the mouth, within our saliva. Our saliva has a lot of functions for us, but in this case, for carb digestion, we produce salivary amylase. So it takes these big, long starch molecules. Remember, those are going to be those long chains of glucose molecules, and we start breaking it down into shorter polysaccharides, including maltose. In the stomach, you've got your acidic environment. Enzymes don't do well in the acidic environment, so the salivary amylase is broken down, can't be used there, so there's no carb digestion occurring within the stomach. In the small intestine, we're going to see most of the carb digestion happening here. So we'll see more amylases breaking the rest of the starch down. And then we'll also see individual enzymes helping to break these things down. Maltose is broken down by maltase. Lactose is broken down by lactase. So they all have their very particular enzymes. Enzymes are very substrate specific. So we'll break those things down and then absorb those monosaccharides into our actual system from the small intestine. So we could see lots of breakdown happening and absorption happening here. In the large intestine, you're going to see fiber and any other kind of carbohydrate that wasn't digested or only partially digested. Those are going to be further broken down by bacteria, and we end up getting some fatty acids out of that, which we can use. And then we get gas as a byproduct of what the bacteria is breaking down. And then we also end up finding that a lot of our fiber that wasn't able to be broken down gets excreted in the feces, again adding to that fecal bulk. Now, one of the health issues you can find with carbohydrates is known as lactose intolerance. Again, lactose is going to be a disaccharide. And remember, when we have disaccharides, in order to absorb those into our system, we need to digest them first, or break them down. So this is going to be our glucose connected to 1-galactose. So for someone who is lactose intolerant, they are missing an enzyme known as lactase. They don't have enough of it. Lactase would break that chemical bond between our monosaccharides. So if you don't have enough, it means that a lot of that lactose moves right through your small intestine and never gets broken down. And then it gets into your large intestine. The bacteria look at the lactose and it's a great meal for them. So what happens here is now we're giving the bacteria lots and lots of food in the large intestine. When the bacteria break things down, they're going to start producing gas. So we end up having too much to be broken down by those bacteria, producing lots of gas. It can cause, an extension of the abdomen or distension where it's kind of stretched out a little bit, cramping, diarrhea. So for people who are lactose intolerant, there are some different options. Of course, avoiding lactose is an option. We can, have people take the enzyme lactase. So I think there's different brands and different things you can do to have that enzyme. So that will help to break down that lactose. And a lot of people just avoid altogether. So there's still alternatives. If people don't have dairy, a major concern with that is the lack of calcium that you're not getting. So you can still get calcium from other sources, your tofu, your legumes, dark green vegetables, canned salmon, sardines, different fortified foods. So for instance, you can get orange juice that's fortified, or you've got calcium added in. Where we have enrichment is where you remove something and then add it back in. Fortification is where you add something where it hasn't been found before, like orange juice. Orange juice didn't start off having calcium. But we add it in for those people who don't drink the milk or have a good source of calcium. You can have lactase treated milk. You can have calcium supplements. Another calcium fortified food are different forms of milk. Your soy milk, your almond milk, your cashew milk, your rice milk, all of those things you're going to have calcium added in. So it makes it a really good alternative for those who can't consume those dairy products. So we can also look at some other benefits that fiber can give us. So for instance, if you have a lot of fiber within a meal, it keeps your stomach full for longer. So fiber has been known to help people who are dieting. If you're going to be dieting, you want to try to keep your stomach full so you're not eating all the time, and fiber really helps out with that process. Where a low fiber meal, your stomach's going to empty a lot faster. You're also going to absorb those sugars much, much faster in a low fiber meal, causing a big spike in your glucose level. So your glucose level shoots up and then it gets back down under control. Whereas a high fiber meal, it causes material to move more slowly through your small intestine. And when that happens, it gives an opportunity for nutrients to be more slowly absorbed. So you don't get this huge spike in your blood glucose level, which can be very beneficial also for anyone who is diabetic. Some more terminology for you are glycemic index, glycemic load, and glycemic response. All of these have to do with our sugar and how our blood glucose levels change. So glycemic index is basically kind of a cheater system almost. This is something that's going to try to make it easier for people to understand how certain foods affect your blood glucose levels. So for instance, white bread, if we give that a number of 100 on the glycemic index, because white bread will cause a spike in your sugar levels. Kidney beans are relatively low compared to that. They're high fiber. They will increase your glucose levels, but much slower and not to the level that white bread would. So we have a lower number there. The glycemic load is the effect of typical portions of food on blood glucose levels. So here we're focusing a lot on the portion size. And the glycemic response is basically what happens to our blood glucose level after we eat something. So not only, how high does it reach, but also how quickly does it get to that level. Now this chart is going to show us a good idea of what happens as our blood glucose levels change, how to return it back to a normal glucose level. So after we consume a meal, on the top there we'll look at, that's a blood vessel, that pink structure there is representing your blood vessel. And this shows us that after we consume a meal, we're going to absorb those glucose molecules, increasing our blood sugar level. So what happens next is that our pancreas will release insulin, and insulin is a hormone that is going to help us reduce our sugar levels within our blood. That glucose is going to go several places. The glucose can go into the muscles and be stored as glycogen. It can go into the liver and get stored as glycogen. And again, glycogen is the polysaccharide that we use to store excess glucose. And also we could take excess glucose and put it into cells. The big picture there is that glucose is removed from the blood. So that is going to result in reducing our blood glucose levels back into a normal range. Now on the bottom there, we'll start all the way down at the bottom where it says decrease blood glucose level, and that's going to happen after you've eaten a while ago. Our cells are taking in glucose, utilizing that energy source, so our blood glucose level starts to get a little low. Here again, our pancreas is going to do a job of releasing another hormone known as glucagon. Glucagon is going to cause our body to start releasing some of that stored glucose. So it's going to tell our liver to take that glycogen, start breaking it up into smaller pieces, and you get glucose. It also can tell our liver to start synthesizing glucose from other molecules. The picture that we're seeing there now is that we're taking glucose out of storage, releasing it back to the blood. So where we were low, we've now upped it and we're back up to normal again. So carbohydrates are really important for us. When we talk about the primary function of carbohydrates, it's really all about energy. It's a fuel source for our body. We can also see other functions for different types of sugars within the body. Lactose, for instance, can be used directly by nerve cells, and also for breastfeeding, so producing breast milk. Ribose and deoxyribose might sound familiar because they are the sugars that are found in our genetic material, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. So deoxyribo and ribo, that comes from the sugar portion of those molecules. We can find ribose in a B vitamin called riboflavin. It helps with cell membrane signaling, so being able to communicate between the two different sides, cushioning, lubrication, but primarily when we talk about carbs, probably the most important function of carbohydrates is the fact that it gives us a fuel source, gives us energy. Now this comes back to the chart we spoke about 2 slides ago, and I just want to focus in here again that this is focusing on homeostasis, the balance within the body. We want to be able to have relatively constant glucose levels within the blood. So if they go up, we secrete insulin, glucose is absorbed into the cells, blood glucose level goes back down to normal. If it's low because we haven't eaten in a while, glucagon gets released by the pancreas. The glucose is released from the liver, so we take the glycogen, break it down into glucose, release it from the liver, and increase our blood glucose level back to normal. All of this is homeostasis, or that relative balance that we like to see within the body. Now, we talked about photosynthesis already, and that's how plants are going to take energy from the sun and carbon dioxide and water, and you're going to combine those things. Chemical reactions will result in producing food. Our body's opposite reaction with that is cellular respiration, where we take energy from nutrients, break those nutrients down, and get energy, a usable form of energy. We use our energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So if you look at the equation there, it's pretty much the exact opposite of what we saw with photosynthesis. But now instead of solar energy, we're using a different type of energy to be released in the form of ATP. So here, our body is going to break down. So if starch is going to be our form of sugar that we're taking in, we break down starch into maltose, maltose into the individual glucose molecules. Now the glucose, when we combine that with oxygen within our cells of our body, we then undergo a series of chemical reactions resulting in carbon dioxide, which we consider a waste product that goes through our blood, and we end up exhaling that carbon dioxide out. We see water here, so we actually have metabolic water. We keep that within the body and use it for all the things we use water for. And then the goal here is ATP, or energy, and that energy can be used for a number of different things. It can be used for muscle contraction, it can be used for transport of materials from one cell to another, movement. So ATP can be used for just about anything that we need energy for. This chart breaks down carbohydrate metabolism, or the chemical reactions associated with our breaking down of carbohydrates. So we can start off with glucose here at the top, and without any oxygen present, we can undergo something known as glycolysis. We'll split that glucose into two. So we end up with what are known as pyruvate molecules, each one having 3 carbons. So glucose gives us 2 pyruvates. Now, without oxygen, glycolysis is all that's going to happen, resulting in us having this pyruvate that we need to get rid of. So we end up undergoing a process known as lactic acid fermentation, giving us the product of 2 ATP per glucose, so that's our energy, and also the byproduct of lactic acid. That anaerobic process can happen. A lot of times we see this occurring when we have a really intense kind of workout, where you don't have enough oxygen to keep supplying your muscles with more and more energy. So we still have a form of energy available, it's just not going to be as rich of an energy source, and you get the byproduct of lactic acid, which can cause a lot of muscle fatigue. On the left-hand side there, when oxygen is present, when you're working out and your breath keeps up with your need for oxygen, we can have that pyruvate go into the mitochondria. Your mitochondria within your cells, that is going to be basically, it's known as your powerhouse for the cell. And that's where the actual cellular respiration can occur. This is much, much more efficient. So for every glucose molecule, instead of just getting those 2 ATP, we get a total of anywhere from 32 to 36 ATP molecules. And we also get the byproduct of carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that we need to get rid of. So when we look at our different processes here, you don't have to break down sugars for energy, although they're ideal because they're very, very efficient for us. So fatty acids, for instance, we can break that down into acetyl-CoA. And if a carb is not available, we're going to get ketones. Ketones, we can use them for energy, but we also, they accumulate in the blood, so we want to make sure that we excrete those out of the body. So if someone doesn't have enough carbohydrates within their diet, they're doing a low-carb diet, a lot of times you'll see what's known as ketoacidosis occur, or ketosis, and that's that extra amount of ketones from breaking down fats. They can still give us energy, but we end up with a lot more waste material, a lot of strain on our kidneys trying to get rid of those ketone bodies. So here we can see, breakdown of what these are. Your ketones or ketone bodies, these are acidic molecules. And so we can use those for energy. Your brain doesn't like to use ketones. It prefers to use glucose as its primary energy source, so it takes a little while to adapt to those ketones. So we can see this in different instances: starvation, low-carb diets, diabetes. Ketosis is where we have the increase in the ketones in the blood, and then ketoacidosis, if you have too many ketones in the blood, you end up with your blood being more acidic. We can't really talk about carbohydrates without touching on diabetes. And this is a disease characterized by high blood glucose levels. And we can break this down into different types. Type 1 diabetes, this is often known as juvenile diabetes or juvenile onset diabetes, but it can develop later on as well. And this is where your body doesn't produce enough insulin because your body is basically attacking the cells. So this is an autoimmune disease where your body is going to break down some of those cells that are producing and secreting insulin within your pancreas. Type 2, your body can be producing enough insulin, but it's not responding properly to that insulin. So those sugars stay in your blood instead of being pulled into the cells and put up for storage. Gestational diabetes is related with pregnancy. So gestational diabetes, you can have it during your entire pregnancy, and then it can go away when you give birth, and typically does. But those people who get gestational diabetes are at a higher risk for type 2 diabetes later in life. This chart demonstrates what we're seeing with diabetes mellitus. And these are two different readings that you're going to get a lot of times when you're testing for diabetes. You've got your starting off point, your fasting blood glucose levels. So in the blue there, that's going to be considered your normal levels, and in the red there, that's considered to be someone with diabetes mellitus. So fasting means that you haven't eaten. Typically, you're going to be looking at 8 hours or more of not eating. Where are your blood glucose levels? Now, for somebody with diabetes, they typically have much higher blood glucose levels even after fasting. You're going to see those beginning levels be a lot higher. Where somebody who doesn't have that, you're going to see those blood glucose levels stay relatively low. Now, after 2 hours, so 2 hours after a meal or 2 hours after drinking glucose solution or having that sugar added into your body, you're going to see that someone with diabetes is going to have a much higher sugar level, and someone who does not have diabetes, their sugar level will have dropped down, because after consuming glucose or having sugars or having a meal, your blood glucose levels go up. When the insulin gets released, your body should respond to that, pull that glucose out of your blood and put it into the cells or put it into storage. Where someone with diabetes mellitus, even though they can be releasing that insulin, their body doesn't respond properly. So that means that that glucose level stays high for a lot longer until the body actually starts using those sugars. So basically, someone with diabetes, their body doesn't do well listening to what that insulin is telling them to do. Now your book does go through and you can see different charts and lists and everything for some different problems that can occur with diabetes. Because when you look at the effect, you might say, oh, well, so what? My sugar stays higher, no big deal. But it can have some major effects within the body. So we can have, damage to blood vessels, and that can give you, it can result in blindness, it can result in stroke, it can result in high blood pressure, it can put, strain on your kidney because now you've got all that extra sugar that your body's considering to be waste material that you've got to filter out. So there are definitely some major physiological effects on the body. So if you want to try to control diabetes, there's different things that you can do. You want to watch, of course, your carb intake and the types of carbs that you're consuming. So increasing those whole grains that don't cause such a big spike in sugar levels. Your refined sugars tend to cause a big spike in sugar levels, and they stay a lot higher. You could see, insulin injections can work for some people who have type 2. With type 1 diabetes, so with type 1, they should need insulin injections because, again, that's where your body is not producing the insulin. Your body is attacking those cells that produce the insulin within your pancreas. A lot of type 2 will take oral drugs to help control those sugar levels. Exercise is really big. Losing weight, exercising can help prevent and manage the disease and even reverse some of those effects. And trying to watch your diet all together. So saturated fat plays a role here, as well as cholesterol and trans fat. And we'll talk more about those lipids when we get into the next chapter. Some people can suffer from hypoglycemia. Those are low blood sugar levels. It's a lot less common than what you see with the diabetes, but it still can be very serious. Now, there's different things that can happen here. If someone is taking, injectable insulin, if you give too much, it can cause a big decrease or too low of blood sugar levels. Or you can see an abnormality in your hormone secretion or response. So, when we're talking about hypoglycemia, you can have two different types. Fasting hypoglycemia is you haven't eaten and your blood sugar level is really low. So, you're not responding properly to the hormones that should be bringing that back up to normal again. So, for someone who hasn't eaten in a while and those blood sugar levels drop abnormally low, that's fasting hypoglycemia. Reactive hypoglycemia means that you consumed food, your blood sugar went up, and instead of producing a normal amount of insulin, your body produced way too much insulin, and then it drops way too far down. So again, instead of returning to a normal level, we're getting low. Hypo is going to tell us low blood sugar levels. Now there's alternatives. There's different things that you can do to decrease your, carb intake and your sugar intakes. And a lot of people with diabetes are really concerned with this. They want to be able to, still have sweet things, but not necessarily have those refined sugars. So that's when you start adding things like sweet and low and equal to, coffee or to iced tea. You can get Splenda and different baked goods. And there's definitely, get little give and take. There's the benefit of reducing the amount of cavities and helping to control blood sugar. So both of those are very, beneficial. But unfortunately, there's been studies and they're associated with weight gain. We see these a lot in low nutrient dense foods. So even though you're not consuming a lot of calories, you're also not getting a lot of nutrients out of these things. And these can also be toxic at high doses. Now we're talking very, very high doses for these things. But again, it's something to watch out for because you don't want to, have huge, huge doses of these different types of sugar. So there's a little bit of give and take here, but if there's something that you enjoy and something that you use responsibly, then they can be, very good alternatives. Now, soluble fiber and cholesterol. We talked a little bit about this before, and this is just a visual to kind of show you how fiber and cholesterol are linked together. I like to cover this just because sometimes that can be a difficult thing for people to picture. So when we are not having soluble fiber, that's the picture on the right there, and just to give you an idea, the organs that we're looking at are the liver. That little green organ is the gallbladder, and that stores bile. And then you've got your small intestine. So the liver produces bile. The bile gets stored, or excess bile gets stored in the gallbladder. And then you've got your small intestine. So our dietary cholesterol, we can absorb that, and you can see those arrows that are moving through the small intestine going into the blood vessel that leads into the liver. So cholesterol gets taken into the blood, transported throughout the body, including the liver, and the liver can take in some of that cholesterol. That cholesterol, the dietary cholesterol that we've absorbed, gets used to help produce bile. Bile is a chemical that we use to help in fat digestion. We'll talk about bile more in the next chapter. So bile then is going to mix with that food. So without soluble fiber, we're going to use the bile, help mix the fat with the enzymes and materials in the small intestine, and then we reabsorb the bile and put it back into storage. So without soluble fiber, we reabsorb the bile. However, with soluble fiber, we're still pulling that cholesterol out, we're still using it to make the bile, but now instead of that bile getting, taken up and put back in the liver and put back into storage again, that bile attaches to that fiber and gets released out of the body, meaning that we're going to now have to use more cholesterol to produce more bile, and that cholesterol comes from somewhere, so that cholesterol is being taken out of the body, reducing our overall cholesterol levels, which is beneficial for us to do. Fiber does a lot of other stuff for us. It's great for our bowel health. High fiber diets decrease constipation. Got to make sure, though, if you're increasing fiber in your diet, you want to make sure you're having enough water and increasing that water intake. And that helps things move through our intestines. It decreases hemorrhoids, basically. It's going to make it easier to move fecal material through our system. And hemorrhoids can occur when there's a lot of straining, as well as diverticula can also occur with a lot of straining. When we have a lot of, if your feces is too hard or too hard to push through. And high fiber diets, we have question marks there next to colon cancer because it hasn't been proven, but there's been a lot of studies linking the two together. That for individuals with high fiber diets, they tend to have a lower incidence of colon cancer. Here's some different pictures that show some of the problems of the low fiber diet. Diverticula, wonderful things to think about here, but if you do have a hard stool causing lots of straining and constipation, that can put pressure on the walls of the large intestine, causing these little pockets to form along the large intestine. And within those pockets, you can have fecal material gather. You can have infections that can happen within diverticula, causing pain for a lot of people. Overall, we want to try to, with carbohydrates, we want to try to choose them, wisely. There's all nutrients are going to give us some kind of benefit. So even if you're having refined sugars, you're getting energy out of it, which is beneficial for us if you're not getting the energy from other places. But there's good choices and there's better choices. So in the 2010 guidelines in My Plate, some of the big things here are really stressing that you increase your whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, your reduced fat dairy products as being good carb sources for you because they're not empty calories. You're getting more bang for your buck here because you are also going to be getting the fiber and the vitamins and the minerals and all of those kinds of things. And you want to try to limit the refined grains and the added sugars because those are considered to be your empty calories. It gets very specific in the dietary guidelines, really encouraging people to limit their intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. In particular, we're looking at things like pop. We want to see, ideally half of your carb intake or half of your grain intake should be whole grains. If it's more than that, that's even better. But we do like to also see a lot of fruit and a lot of vegetables. So a lot of the common sense things that you can think about are what are really good for us. Whole grains are good for you, fruits are good for you, vegetables are good for you. So when you're choosing carbohydrates, those are really considered to be excellent sources. You can pay attention to the labeling on food. And this is what those labels mean. So if something says that it's high fiber, it's 20% or more of your daily value in every serving. So that's good. So you're really, increasing your fiber intake. Instead of being high fiber, even something that's a good source of fiber is still giving you 10 to 19% of your daily value in a serving. So if it just said contained fiber, it could mean that it has, 1% of your daily intake, which, is still some fiber, but it's not great. Here we're looking at those higher levels, which are really good, especially if you have different fiber sources throughout the day. When we look at food labels, there's a lot of things you can look at, and we've already did this a little bit, but you can see here, you can look at the ingredients there on the left-hand side to give you an idea of the types of sugars that are being added in. And when you see plain old sugar or high fructose corn syrup, you know that there's a lot of refined and added sugars into that. You can look at a label to tell you the amount of fiber. And then you can also see your sugar, your total amount of sugars there. So when you're paying attention to labels, it can tell you a lot about the carbohydrate amounts and the types of carbohydrates that are added into your foods.